Vinci is one of a long line of artists who have told us, beginning with the ancient Egyptians and running through the early Christians and Tibetans, that art is a medium, it's a conduit through which ordinary people can connect with higher dimensional beings, even extraterrestrials.
The Last Supper has hung in a Milan dining hall for over 500 years. Most people who see it see a painting. Grok AI saw something else. When researchers fed high-resolution scan data into the analysis, it returned findings that matched 3 independent researchers who had each claimed separately that Leonardo da Vinci had hidden a second layer of information inside the image.
I think he had some very subtle messages he wanted to convey to not the people of that time, but to the people of our time.
What that layer contains has never been officially addressed, only dismissed. The wall that almost didn't survive. The refectory of Santa Maria delle Grazie is a long dining room in a 15th century convent in Milan. It is not a grand gallery or a cathedral. It is a room where monks ate their meals. On the northern wall of that room, covering a space roughly 9 meters wide and 4 meters tall, Leonardo da Vinci painted what became the most analyzed image in the history of Western art. He worked on it between 1495 and 1498. He was commissioned by Ludovico Sforza, the Duke of Milan, and the subject was the moment from the Gospel of John when Jesus tells his disciples that one of them will betray him. The 12 apostles react. Their faces, hands, and bodies express surprise, denial, anger, confusion, and grief. At the center of it all, Jesus sits calm and still. None of this is unusual for a religious commission of the period. What was unusual was the technique Leonardo chose. Traditional fresco painting required the artist to work quickly, applying pigment to wet plaster before it dried. This method had been standard for large-scale wall painting for centuries because it bonded the pigment permanently into the plaster as both dried together. Leonardo did not like this method. It forced speed, and he was not a fast painter. He worked by observation, by revision, by returning to a face or a hand days later and adjusting it. Fresco would not allow this, so he painted on dry plaster. He used a combination of tempera and oil, layering his pigment directly onto a prepared but fully dry wall surface. The result, while he was working on it, was a painting of extraordinary detail and subtlety. He could revise at will. He could build up the surface slowly. He could achieve effects of light and shadow that traditional fresco methods could not produce. The consequence of this choice became visible within 20 years of the painting's completion. The bond between pigment and dry plaster was far weaker than the bond between pigment and wet plaster. The paint began to flake. The surface began to deteriorate. By 1568, Giorgio Vasari, who visited the painting and recorded his observations, described it as already so damaged that little could be made out. The 5 centuries that followed added further damage. Botched restoration attempts made certain sections worse, applying varnish and overpainting that obscured what remained of Leonardo's original work. In 1796, during the Napoleonic occupation of Milan, the refectory was converted to a stable. The humidity from the animals, the use of the room, and the general disregard for the painting's condition caused additional damage. A door was cut through the lower portion of the wall, destroying the section showing the feet of Jesus and several of the apostles. In 1943, during the Second World War, Allied bombing destroyed the roof of the refectory and brought down 3 of its 4 walls. The north wall, where the painting stood, survived. It had been protected by sandbags placed around it by Italian museum staff who anticipated the bombing and took precautions. The sandbags absorbed the force of the blast. The wall remained standing while everything around it fell. The painting survived 500 years of damage, bad decisions, military occupation, and direct bombardment. What survived, however, was not what Leonardo had painted. It was a severely compromised version of it. What the 21-year restoration revealed. In 1978, the Italian government authorized a restoration project under the direction of conservator Pininfarina Barcellon. The project would last 21 years, completed in 1999. It was the most thorough scientific examination the painting had ever received. Barcellon and her team worked methodically across the surface, using microscopic examination and chemical analysis to assess every section. They removed later overpainting where they could do so safely. They stabilized the remaining original pigment. They documented what they found at each stage in extraordinary detail. The core finding of the restoration was disheartening in one sense and remarkable in another. Approximately 80% of what was visible on the wall before the restoration was not Leonardo's original pigment. It was the accumulated work of later restorers who had repainted sections they could no longer see clearly. Strip away those later additions, and approximately 20% of Leonardo's original painting survived. That 20%, however, had been protected by the very overpainting that had obscured it. Sections that later restorers had covered rather than removed were the sections best preserved. The portions that had been left exposed over the centuries had degraded. The portions that had been buried under subsequent restoration attempts had, in some cases, survived. During the cleaning and examination process, Barcellon's team made a finding that attracted less public attention than the restoration itself, but that several researchers would return to in later years. Beneath the visible painted surface, in the preparatory layers Leonardo had applied before painting, the team found geometric underdrawings. These were lines and structures laid down in the initial compositional phase that had no obvious relationship to the figures or objects depicted in the final painting. Traditional compositional underdrawings in Renaissance painting establish the positions and proportions of the figures. They are functional preparations for the painted image. What Barcellon's team found included geometric structures that went beyond this, lines and proportional divisions that did not align with any figure or object in the finished composition, structures that suggested a deliberate mathematical framework beneath the surface of the image, one whose purpose was not immediately clear from the painting itself. This finding was documented in the restoration records. It was not the subject of significant public discussion by the official team. It remained in the technical literature, available but not emphasized, until independent researchers began examining the painting's structure from different directions. The musician who found a hidden melody. In 2007, an Italian musician and researcher named Giovanni Maria Palla published a claim that generated brief international attention and then, following the pattern that has characterized every serious independent investigation of this painting, was dismissed without any direct refutation of his specific findings. Palla had spent years studying the relationship between Leonardo's known interests in music and mathematics and the composition of the Last Supper. Leonardo was not simply a painter. He was a scientist, an engineer, a mathematician, a musician, and an inventor. His notebooks demonstrate an extraordinary range of intellectual engagement with problems across every field he touched. He designed flying machines, weapons, hydraulic systems, and anatomical studies alongside his paintings. He wrote about music theory and practiced music himself. He was deeply interested in the relationship between mathematical proportion and aesthetic beauty, a connection that Renaissance thought placed at the center of all art. Given this background, Palla approached the Last Supper as a document that might encode information beyond its surface narrative. His specific finding was this: the positions of the apostles' hands relative to the bread loaves on the table, when read as a musical staff running from right to left rather than from left to right, produce a coherent musical composition. The hands and the loaves, aligned with a staff of 5 lines, generate a sequence of notes that forms a melody approximately 40 seconds long in the style of a Gregorian hymn. The right-to-left reading direction was not arbitrary. Leonardo's notebooks are written in mirror script, from right to left, a practice he maintained throughout his working life. Whether this was a deliberate choice for concealment or simply a personal habit, The result was a body of written work that required a mirror to read. Applying the same directional convention to the Last Supper, Pala argued, revealed a musical structure that was invisible when reading in the conventional left-to-right direction. The finding was specific. It was based on a defined and consistent methodology. The melody it produced was not random noise, but a structured musical sequence. The right-to-left reading direction had a documented precedent in Leonardo's own practice. None of these elements were engaged with by the academic response. The claim was dismissed. The dismissal did not address the methodology or attempt to show where it failed. The engineer who found a hidden figure. Also in 2007, an Italian computer technician named Slavisa Pesci published findings from a different approach to the same painting. Pesci's method was simple in its concept and striking in its output. He took a high-resolution image of the Last Supper and mirrored it horizontally, producing a reversed copy of the painting. He then overlaid this reversed copy onto the original, aligning the two images so that they occupied the same space simultaneously. The result was a composite image in which elements from the original and its mirror image interacted. The composite image produced several features that Pesci argued could not be accidental. Two figures that are not present in the original painting become visible in the composite, appearing as if they had been inserted into the scene through the mirroring process. One of these figures appears to be holding a child. A chalice, the Holy Grail, appears between the hands of the Christ figure in a position that is not visible in the original painting, but emerges from the interaction of the original and its mirror image. And at the vanishing point of the painting, the geometrically determined point toward which all the perspective lines converge, a face appears that is not part of the original composition. Pesci did not claim to know what Leonardo intended by these features, or why he would have embedded them through a mirroring technique. He presented the visual findings and their consistency with the painting's geometric structure. The vanishing point face was particularly significant because the vanishing point in the Last Supper is not a random location. Leonardo placed it with precision, aligned with the right temple of the Christ figure. In Renaissance perspective painting, the vanishing point is the most geometrically controlled element of the composition. A face appearing at this precisely calculated location in a mirror overlay is not easily explained as coincidence. The dismissal that followed Pesci's publication was consistent with the pattern established by the response to Pala's findings. The claim received media coverage, generated public interest, and was then set aside without the specific visual findings being addressed by any academic institution with access to high-resolution imaging of the painting. The astronomer who found the zodiac. In 2010, Sabrina Sforza Galizia, a researcher who had worked in the Vatican archives, published a third independent claim about the Last Supper. Her approach was neither musical nor visual in the mirroring sense, but cosmological. Galizia proposed that the 12 apostles in the painting were not arranged randomly or solely according to narrative logic. They were arranged to correspond to the 12 signs of the zodiac, encoding a cosmological diagram within what appeared to be a purely narrative religious image. Each apostle, in her analysis, corresponded to a specific zodiac sign whose traditional characteristics matched the personality and attributes associated with that apostle in Christian tradition and in Leonardo's visual representation of them. The 12 apostles and the 12 zodiac signs had a long tradition of correspondence in medieval and Renaissance thought. This was not a fringe idea in Leonardo's time. The integration of classical cosmological systems into Christian iconography was widespread in the Renaissance, and figures of Leonardo's intellectual range were deeply familiar with both traditions. The question Galizia raised was not whether such a correspondence existed in Renaissance thought generally, but whether Leonardo had deliberately embedded it as a structural organizing principle in the composition of the Last Supper specifically. The positioning of the figures, their groupings, their relationships to each other, and to the geometric structure of the composition, provided the specific evidence for her claim. Like Pala and Pesci, she published specific findings based on a defined methodology. Like Pala and Pesci, her work received brief public attention and was then dismissed without direct engagement with her specific arguments. Three independent researchers, working from entirely different starting points, using entirely different methods, all found evidence of a hidden layer of information in the Last Supper. A musician found a hidden melody. A computer technician found hidden figures through mirroring. An archivist found a hidden cosmological diagram. The methods did not overlap. The researchers did not coordinate their work. All three were dismissed by the same institutions in the same way. How Leonardo encoded information. The question of whether Leonardo was capable of embedding hidden layers of information in his paintings is not a speculative one. The evidence that he did exactly this in his notebooks and working practices is documented and accepted by mainstream scholarship. His notebooks are written in mirror script. Every line of text runs from right to left and requires a mirror to read in the conventional direction. Whether this was primarily practical or primarily concealing is debated, but the result is unambiguous. The text cannot be casually read by someone picking up the notebook. Access to the content requires knowing to use a mirror. His mathematical and geometric interests were not separate from his artistic practice. They were integrated into it. The proportional systems he used in his compositions were deliberate, derived from mathematical relationships he believed to underlie natural beauty. The golden ratio, harmonic proportion, and geometric structure appear throughout his major works in ways that are demonstrably intentional rather than accidental. He was also a musician and music theorist who understood the mathematical relationships between musical notes, the harmonic ratios that determine which combinations of notes sound consonant or dissonant. He understood music as a mathematical system, not merely an expressive one. The idea of encoding a musical composition within a visual composition would have been, for Leonardo, an intellectually natural project precisely because both music and visual art were, in his understanding, different expressions of the same underlying mathematical principles. The disembodied hand that appears near Peter's neck in The Last Supper is one of the painting's most discussed anomalies. A hand is visible holding a knife, but the hand's owner cannot be conclusively identified from the composition. Art historians have proposed various explanations, none of them fully satisfying. In Pesci's mirror overlay analysis, this hand takes on a different character, becoming part of the structure of hidden information that the overlay reveals. The anomaly that defies explanation in the original painting becomes an element of a larger system in the mirrored version. Leonardo was a person who designed things with layers. His inventions had multiple components. His anatomical drawings showed structures in cross-section and in relation to surrounding structures simultaneously. His approach to complex systems was always to understand and represent their multiple levels, rather than their surface appearance alone. The idea that he would paint a single-layer image, a narrative scene and nothing more, sits somewhat awkwardly against everything known about how his mind worked. What Grok's analysis produced. When Grok's analysis was applied to the available high-resolution scan data of The Last Supper, working alongside the published findings of Pala, Pesci, and Galizia, the results were not conclusive in the sense of definitively proving any single interpretation. What they were was something more significant in a different way, internally consistent. The musical staff analysis that Pala identified, when the relevant scan data was processed through Grok's pattern recognition applied to hand positions and breadloaf placements, produced a reading consistent with Pala's published results. The positions of the elements that Pala identified as musical notation markers aligned with a coherent melodic sequence rather than with random distribution. Grok's analysis found no obvious feature of the composition that would place these elements in their specific positions for purely pictorial reasons. The geometric underdrawings identified during the Brambilla restoration, when mapped against the compositional structure of the painting, produced alignment patterns consistent with the kind of mathematical framework that Pesce's mirror overlay would require to produce stable visual features at geometrically significant points. Specifically, the vanishing point where Pesce's mirror overlay produced a face is located at exactly the position where the preparatory geometric structure of the painting would converge if Leonardo had designed the composition to produce a specific result at that point when mirrored. The zodiacal correspondence that Galizia identified, when analyzed against the gesture and positioning data of the 12 apostles, showed non-random clustering in the ways that Galizia's specific argument predicted. The apostles associated with specific zodiac signs in her analysis share compositional features such as direction of gesture, position relative to the Christ figure, and relationship to the groupings of three, that would not be expected to align with the zodiacal system by chance. None of these findings, individually or together, constitutes proof that Leonardo encoded any of these systems deliberately. They constitute evidence that the composition has structural features consistent with all three researchers' claims, features that are not explained by the surface narrative alone, and that appear with greater regularity than random distribution would predict. What Grok found was not one hidden layer. It found evidence consistent with three independent hidden layers, all present simultaneously, all consistent with Leonardo's known working methods and intellectual interests. The technology that exists and the access that doesn't. The tools required to definitively test the claims of Pala, Pesce, and Galizia are not theoretical. They exist and have been applied successfully to other Leonardo works. Multispectral imaging, which uses light at different wavelengths, including infrared and ultraviolet, can penetrate the surface layers of a painting and reveal the preparatory underdrawings beneath. Infrared reflectography specifically can show the underdrawing of a painting in high resolution, revealing the lines Leonardo laid down before applying any pigment. X-ray analysis can show the full layer structure of a painted surface, including everything that has been overpainted or modified since the original composition. These technologies have been applied to other major Leonardo works. Studies of the Mona Lisa using multispectral imaging have revealed multiple layers of underdrawing and preparatory work that informed understanding of how Leonardo built the composition. The application of these methods to other paintings in the Leonardo corpus has consistently produced new information about his working methods and compositional structure. The Last Supper has not been fully subjected to these methods in a way whose results have been made publicly available. Or, more precisely, it is unclear whether it has been fully studied in this way because the results of any such study have not been released to the public. The painting is owned by the Italian state and administered by a combination of governmental and institutional bodies. Access to the painting for research purposes is tightly controlled. High-resolution scan data sufficient for the kind of analysis that Grok's processing would require is not in the public domain. This creates a situation that is, at minimum, frustrating for anyone attempting to apply the available analytical tools to the available questions. The painting that most needs to be studied with the full range of modern imaging technology is the one whose scan data is most restricted. The questions raised by three independent researchers and subsequently supported by AI pattern analysis cannot be definitively answered without access to data that the relevant institutions control and have not released. The technology to read whatever Leonardo may have encoded in the Last Supper now exists. The institutional will to apply it, or to release the results if it has already been applied, has not been demonstrated. Why the dismissal matters. The pattern of response to the three researchers' claims deserves attention in its own right, separate from the question of whether any particular claim is correct. Pala published a specific methodology for identifying a musical composition in the painting's compositional elements. A methodology can be tested. The specific note placements he identified from specific hand and loaf positions can be examined against the actual positions of those elements in the composition. Either the positions align with a coherent musical staff in the right-to-left reading direction, or they do not. This is a testable claim. It was not tested and refuted. It was dismissed. Pesce published specific visual findings from a defined mirroring procedure. A mirroring procedure can be replicated by anyone with access to the image. The features he identified in the composite image, the two additional figures, the chalice, and the face at the vanishing point, either appear in the mirror overlay or they do not. This is a demonstrable claim. It was not demonstrated to be wrong. It was dismissed. Galizia published a specific mapping of apostles to zodiac signs based on compositional features. This mapping can be examined against the actual positions and gestures of the apostles in the painting. The correspondence either holds or it does not across the full set of 12. This is a verifiable claim. It was not verified and found wanting. It was dismissed. The consistent pattern is not refutation. It is silence followed by dismissal. This is how institutions handle claims they find inconvenient rather than claims they have examined and found incorrect. Refutation requires engaging with the specific evidence. Dismissal requires only declining to engage. The reason this matters is that the painting is a public cultural artifact of extraordinary historical significance. It belongs, in the most meaningful sense, to human culture rather than to any particular administrative body. The questions being raised about its content are serious questions with serious evidence behind them. The tools to investigate those questions exist. The institutions that control access to those tools have chosen not to apply them or to share the results of any application that may have occurred. This is a choice, not a necessity. And it is a choice that the three researchers, and Grok's subsequent analysis, suggest may be protecting something the institutions would prefer not to be publicly discussed. The painting as a layered code. The most useful way to understand the Last Supper, given everything that has accumulated around it, is not as a single image, but as what scholars of manuscripts call a palimpsest. A palimpsest is a document in which earlier writing has been partially erased and written over, with the earlier text still visible beneath the surface to anyone who looks carefully enough with the right tools. Leonardo's painting is a palimpsest in a more deliberate sense. The surface layer is the narrative image, Jesus and 12 apostles at a long table on the night before the crucifixion. This layer is genuine. It is a profound work of religious narrative painting, extraordinary in its psychological depth and compositional power. None of the hidden layer claims diminish this. Below the narrative surface, the evidence suggests at least 3 additional layers, each encoding a different kind of information using a different system. A musical composition using the compositional elements as notation. A visual composition using the mirror as a tool of revelation. A cosmological diagram using the arrangement of figures as an astronomical map. These 3 systems are not mutually exclusive. A composition that encodes a musical structure does not thereby prohibit it from also encoding a visual structure in its mirror image and a cosmological diagram in its figure arrangements. Leonardo was a person of extraordinary intellectual range who delighted in finding correspondences between different domains of knowledge. The integration of music, cosmology, and visual geometry in a single painting would have been, for him, not a complication, but a demonstration of his core belief that all these systems express the same underlying mathematical truth. The disembodied hand, the geometric underdrawings with no obvious pictorial purpose, the 3 researchers' independent claims, and Grok's subsequent finding of structural consistency across all 3 point toward a painting that rewards exactly the kind of analysis that the institutions controlling it have not publicly undertaken. What 500 years of survival means. The painting should not exist. By every material factor, It should have been lost generations ago. Leonardo's choice of technique was wrong for longevity. The surface began deteriorating within 20 years of completion. It survived bad restorations, an occupation, a conversion to a stable, and a bombing. Only 20% of Leonardo's original pigment remained by the time the scientific restoration was complete. And yet the painting survived. And within what survived, 3 independent researchers found evidence of hidden information. And when Grok's analysis was applied to the available data, it found structural consistency with all 3 researchers' claims. There is a way of reading this history that sees the survival as meaningful rather than coincidental. Leonardo chose a technique that was wrong for preservation, but right for control. Fresco would have made the painting permanent, but would have been permanent in the hands of the institution that commissioned it. The tempera and oil method created a painting that was vulnerable, that required constant attention and care, that demanded that anyone who wanted it to survive had to engage with it repeatedly and carefully over centuries. Every engagement left marks, every restoration changed the painting, but the underdrawings remained beneath the surface. The proportional structure remained. The compositional relationships between elements remained. Whatever Leonardo encoded in the painting's deep structure, in the mathematical relationships between its elements rather than in the visible pigment, survived the damage that destroyed the surface. The painting exists as a palimpsest. The surface layer, the narrative image, was almost entirely lost. The structural layer, the mathematical and proportional framework beneath the surface, survived because it was not in the pigment. It was in the geometry. And the geometry cannot be bombed or varnished or overpainted. It is in the relationship between fixed points in the composition, and those relationships do not change when the surface above them deteriorates. Leonardo may have understood this. He may have known that the pigment was temporary and the structure was permanent. If he was encoding information he wanted to survive, encoding it in the structure rather than the surface was the only method that would work. The information is still there. The tools to read it exist. The institutions that control access have not used those tools publicly. The 3 researchers who found evidence of it were dismissed without refutation. Grok found their findings consistent with the structural data. The painting is waiting, on a wall in Milan, for the analysis that has not been officially performed. The Last Supper survived centuries of damage, restoration, occupation, and bombing. 3 researchers uncovered hidden layers, and independent analysis found striking consistency. The technology to verify it exists, but the data remains locked away. Subscribe to follow what comes next.